Whiskey, you either like it or you hate it. You've sipped it neat on the rocks or mix in a cocktail. But have you ever wondered where that glass of whiskey came from? Whiskey making is huge. So today, let's talk all about distilleries. From mashing grains to aging in oak barrels. Get ready to learn the secrets behind your favorite liquor. Well, whiskey is a golden brown, distilled spirit made from fermented grain. It's aged in wooden barrels, giving it its signature flavors. Most whiskeys pack at least 40% alcohol by volume, or ABV. There are many types of whiskey, each with its own unique traits. They're often defined by where they're made, the grains used, or how they're aged. The taste, it's warm, spicy sweet with a hint of caramel. The name whiskey comes from the Gaelic phrase, Uisce Bia, meaning water of life. Its exact origins are unclear, but grain spirits have been around in Europe for over 500 years. Some say whiskey began in Ireland around 1,000 years ago and was later introduced to Scotland by monks. The first records of Scottish whiskey making date back to 1494, when Europeans came to the Americas. They brought their distilling skills. Rum was made in New England by the 1600s. And by the 1700s, whiskey became essential. In places like western Pennsylvania, farmers found it easier to turn their grain into whiskey since it stored well and was easier to transport. Whiskey even played a role in U.S. history. In 1794, farmers rebelled against a whiskey tax. This eventually led to the Whiskey Rebellion. President George Washington had to send troops to restore order. Many whiskey makers moved west to Indiana and Kentucky, areas now famous for the craft. The industry boomed, peaking in 1911. But Prohibition in 1920 put a stop to legal whiskey production until it ended in 1933. Another production high came in 1951 with 800 million liters made. Today, the U.S. produces around 400 million liters annually. The process of distillation started with basic setups: a heated container, a cooling tube, and a receptacle. Over time, pot stills refine the process. These are still used for whiskey. In Scotland and Ireland in 1826, Robert Stein introduced continuous distillation. This method is now standard for mass-produced whiskey. Whiskey's appeal is global. While the U.S. leads in production in consumption, Scotch whiskey, or simply Scotch, remains the gold standard worldwide. You can't beat it. Whiskey starts with a few simple ingredients that work together to create its distinct character. The foundation of whiskey is a mash made from grains. Some common grains include malted barley, rye, corn, and wheat. Each grain influences the flavor and type of whiskey. For example, rye whiskey must have at least 51% rye in its mash. But Kentucky bourbon needs at least 51% corn. After distillation, water is added to adjust the alcohol content. This step makes sure the whiskey reaches the desired alcohol by volume. U.S. regulations allow whiskey to include up to 2.5% added flavors, though straight whiskey contains none. Some producers add spices, botanicals, or color during distillation or aging to give their product a unique touch. Aging is crucial. Whiskey sits in wooden barrels for years, developing its flavor and color. In the U.S., whiskey must age for at least 2 years. But many are aged for 10 to 12 years for richer and more complex taste. Now that we know everything we need and the basics, it's time to see how it's actually made. Every whiskey starts with grain, either malted or unmalted. Truckloads of grain arrive straight from farms and are stoned in silos, but before their use, the grain is carefully inspected and cleaned to remove dust in any unwanted particles. For malt, whiskey barley is the star ingredient. It goes through a process called malting, where the grains are moistened and allowed to partially germinate. During germination, enzymes are released to turn starches into sugars. The process is halted by drying the barley with heat. This method is commonly used in Scotch whiskey. Other whiskeys like Irish single pot still or bourbon use unmalted grains instead. The next step is mashing. This is where grains are mixed with water to create a base for fermentation. Whiskey makers take the chosen grains like malted wheat, flaked maize or rye, and they combine it with hot water and stir the mix to make sure everything blends. During this stage, starches in the grains are broken down into sugars. Ground grains are placed in a large tank known as a mash tun, where they are mixed with hot water. Even when unmalted grains are used, a bit of malted barley is added to help with starch to sugar conversion. The result is a thick porridge-like mixture called mash. Once the sugar has been extracted, the mash is ready for fermentation. Once the mash is ready, it's time to ferment it. The mixture is placed in the large vats, often called wash packs, and left to ferment for 1 to 2 weeks. During fermentation, yeast is added to the mash or wort. The yeast feeds on the sugars, converting them into alcohol. This process usually takes between 48 and 96 hours, depending on the yeast strain and fermentation time. The result is a beer-like liquid called distiller's beer, or wash, which has an alcohol content of around 7 to 10%. After fermentation, the solids are separated and discarded. The liquid alcohol, or ethanol, moves on to the next stage of whiskey making. Distillation is where whiskey starts to take shape. It purifies the alcohol by heating the liquid until it vaporizes and then cooling it back into a liquid. This process basically increases the alcohol content and removes impurities. Most distillation happens in copper stills, which also help eliminate unwanted flavors. But this step is crucial, especially since there are 2 main types of stills: pot stills and column stills. Pot stills are commonly used for Scotch malt whiskeys, Irish whiskeys, and some American whiskeys. This process works in batches. First, the wash is heated in the low wine still. Since alcohol boils at a low temperature than water, the alcohol vaporizes and passes through the still neck. Then it's condensed into liquid. This liquid, around 20% ABV, is distilled again in the spirit still. Sometimes a third distillation is added. The final spirit comes out at 60% to 70% ABV. Distillers separate the heads and tails, which are basically the beginning and end of the distillation. It's because the flavor is not pleasant. You don't want that in your bottle. The best part, called the heart, is collected for aging. Then there are the column stills or coffee stills. They're used for bourbon, rye, and many grain whiskeys. But unlike pot stills, they run continuously. The distiller's beer enters at the top and flows downward through perforated plates. Steam rises from the bottom, separating the alcohol vapor from solids. As the vapor moves through the plates, heavy substances are removed, so the alcohol content increases. The vapor is then condensed into liquid. Column stills can produce alcohol as high as 95% ABV, but whiskey is typically distilled to a lower proof. Some distilleries use hybrid stills, which combine pod and column still designs for versatility. But here's the thing. Not all liquid from distillation is created equal. As the ethanol distills, its composition changes. Distillers carefully separate it into different parts. The first 35% of the run, called the foreshots and heads, contains methanol and acetone. These can be volatile, toxic, and definitely not the kind of thing you want in your whiskey, so distillers discard them. Next comes the star of the show, the hearts. This middle 30% is pure, clean, and packed with flavor. Finally, the tails make up the last 35%. These are less refined, but can be redistilled to squeeze out any remaining potential. By sorting these parts, distillers make sure only the highest quality liquid moves forward. But this is also to minimize waste. Then, we come to the maturation of the whiskey. This is where whiskey gets its signature character. After distillation, the liquid is poured into wooden barrels and left to age for at least 2 years, and usually much longer. The type of barrel makes all the difference. American bourbons and ryes must be aged in brand new charred oak barrels, but Scotch whiskies often use barrels that previously held sherry or wine. Some barrels are toasted, others heavily charred, and each method influences the flavor, color, and aroma of the whiskey. As the spirit sits in the barrel, it interacts with the wood, soaking up its natural compounds. Over time, some of the alcohol evaporates. It's affectionately called the angel share. This evaporation fills the aging warehouse with a warm, rich aroma that whiskey fans can only dream of. When the aging is complete, distillers test the whiskey to ensure it has the right alcohol content. Some add filtered water to adjust the proof, either before aging, after aging, or both. The result, a beautifully matured whiskey that's ready for the final steps. Now to the blending. This is where art meets science. But not all whiskeys are blended. Those straight whiskeys and single malt scotches skip this step, they're bottled straight from the barrel. But for most other types, blending is so important to achieving a consistent taste profile. Here's how it works. Different batches of whiskey are mixed to create a balanced flavor. Neutral grain spirit might be added to mellow things out, while caramel ensures a uniform color. Some blends even get a touch of sherry or port wine to help the flavors harmonize. Blended Scotch whiskey, for example, combines several strong malt whiskeys with milder grain whiskeys. Premium blends can include over 60 different malt whiskeys. It's a critical step that separates good whiskey from truly great whiskey, especially for Scotch. And you have to remember, whiskey isn't a one-size-fits-all spirit. Its character is shaped by where it's made, the grains in its mash, and how it's blended or aged. Each type tells a unique story, starting with blended whiskey, which combines various whiskeys for a smoother flavor, sometimes from different distilleries. Bourbon takes us to America, often Kentucky, with its requirement of at least 51%, coining the mash and aging in new charred oak barrels. The result is a sweet, nutty profile. But Canadian whiskey must be aged at least 3 years in Canada and can include flavorings. Each brand has its own personality. Ireland brings us Irish whiskey. It's crafted from malt barley and other grains and aged in wooden casks for a minimum of 3 years. Its smooth, subtle character often shines when aged in cherry or rum barrels. Japanese whiskey, inspired by Scotch, offers a diverse range of flavors. Some smoky and Scotch-like, others uniquely Japanese thanks to local oak. Rye whiskey, with its mash bill of at least 51%. Rye is lighter bodied, but delivers a distinctive spiciness. Like bourbon, it's aged in new, charred oak barrels in the U.S. Scotch whiskey, made in Scotland and aged for at least 3 years, owes its smoky edge to peat fires used during production. For those who appreciate purity, single malt whiskey comes from a single distillery using one type of malted grain. It might include whiskey from several barrels, unless it's labeled single cask. Finally, Tennessee whiskey adds its own twist. It filters the spirit through sugar maple charcoal before aging, known as the Lincoln County process. This step gives it a smooth, distinct flavor. Every type of whiskey follows its own rules, so if you're a fan, there's a lot to explore. The process of whiskey making wraps up with bottling. Once the whiskey has matured to perfection, it's poured into labeled bottles, ready for the world to enjoy. Whiskey makers make sure it's bottled at a minimum of 40% ABV. Before this step, it might go through a filtration process, like chill filtering, which keeps it clear even when served with ice. For large brands, barrels are blended together during bottling, sometimes combining dozens or even hundreds. If a single barrel is bottled on its own, the label proudly displays single cask or single barrel. Honestly, quality control is the backbone of whiskey making. Every step from filtering water to monitoring distillation temperatures is carefully managed. Grains are screened for the perfect size, and yeast is grown with precision to avoid contamination even during aging. Master tasters sample the barrels to ensure they're on track. When it's time to blend, master blenders step in to make the ideal flavor for each batch. But even with all these steps, whiskey making is still a near-zero waste process. Leftover mash finds new life as animal feed, and even the charcoal used and Tennessee whiskey becomes barbecued briquettes. But as the whiskey industry moves forward, the future looks more exciting. With advancements in technology and a growing interest in sustainability, whiskey makers are exploring new methods to craft their spirits. One trend is the push toward eco-friendly production practices. Distilleries are investing in renewable energy sources, like solar and wind, to reduce their carbon footprint. Some are even experimenting with water-saving techniques. The use of alternative barrels is another one. While oak has been the staple for centuries, some distillers are exploring different woods or even reusing barrels to create unique flavor profiles. Expect to see more whiskeys aged in exotic barrels, like cherrywood or maple, and that's not all. Innovation in whiskey production also means more experimentation with aging methods. Some distilleries are accelerating the aging process using technology that mimics the natural aging environment. They do this by controlling temperature and humidity or using pressure to speed up the maturation. On the consumer side, whiskey fans are looking for more personalized experiences. You can get limited edition releases to customizable labels. As new whiskey drinkers enter the market, they have a lot to look forward to. Well, there you have it, the look behind the whiskey in your glass. If you enjoyed this dive in the how, check out more videos on our channel. From how your favorite foods are made to everyday items, there's a lot to find out. Until then, thanks for watching.